The lost sheep and the good shepherd. They wouldn't half be lost out here. But a very traditional reading fits perfectly well for the season of creation. The sinner lost, the Saviour rescues. But even a traditional reading comes with a subversive power that helps us discover what's distinctive about following Christ, rather than just trying to live a good life according to the received standards of our time and place. And one wonders at the budget, of course, of the housewife's party over the lost coin found. Is she at all breaking even? But why worry when there's the bonus of sustaining joy? It's like the last laugh of the foolishly excessive joy of the Good Shepherd, who goes out of their way to ensure the return of that lost sheep, who might be you yourself or someone you know, someone you care for, or even humanity as a whole. But the mention of flock does, in the first instance, direct us to the integrity of our own Christian community. How do we cope with dissent and dissatisfaction, or the poison of climate denial or evasion? Or even for those in a pastoral role, be it priests, ministers, deacons, groups in the local churches charged with the care of fellow members. How do we cope? How do we cope when it's a matter of convincing ourselves and others to engage with change when we have lost the plot? The macho game of winning an argument really isn't fit for purpose, even when change is obvious and urgent. That is not how the sheep are reintroduced and the flock reshaped, the flock renewed. I won't say restored. We really need to get away from that naive idea of putting things back the way they were. The fantasy of return to a new normal and the irresponsible foolishness of huge finance to fall back on fossil fuels when there's that pressure from the war that Russia has started, rather than accelerating energy efficiency and just transition, full tilt. In environmental terms, what we're seeing in some places in Europe is like responding to one lost sheep by driving the whole flock to stray. If the lost sheep can be returned to a flock repurposed with such joy, then it's right to emphasise that the good of all, and indeed of all creation, is far greater as a priority than any punishment or humiliation or retribution. We haven't got time for such peevishness or bitterness when every positive contribution counts, and when every individual, every community, every nation not on board with care of the earth will continue to do real harm to all others. How do we ensure that we're not too shy, not too embarrassed, not too grown up to celebrate even the smallest positive step and change of mind, rather than being overcome by the overwhelmingly bad news on which our news media seems to thrive? How do we build up the spiritual resilience of our congregations to face reality with hope? Clue: even and especially the Good Shepherd does not underestimate their own need to be sustained by celebration. Our own need to be so much in love with creation that we are driven by joy. So often it's not just those outside, our community, our church, our flock, that are in need. It is indeed also ourselves, beaten down by bereavement of the deceptive vision of a church in charge, rather than a church at work for healing. We can be lost in plain sight. Are we prepared to be picked up and taken home? Now, I love the generous and positive way in which a sinner is lost rather than evil. No punishment is meted out, no humiliation is involved. Indeed, the most special care being carried on the weary shoulders of that delighted shepherd. It's made available to the lost sheep rather than a leash and a stick. Clearly too, given the chance, the sheep would rather be back with the flock. Is your community one which welcomes back or greets hesitant returners with resentment? The integrity and well-being of the entire flock is the shepherd's aim. Or would you prefer that the wayward sheep would be beaten and isolated on their return? Myself, I am over the moon when anyone, especially a dedicated Christian, finally gets it about the deep and intimately integrated connection of our faith and our partnership with the living earth. Who then is the lost sheep? Who are the unstraying majority? Locally, globally, within our own church and maybe personally. Perhaps if we go beyond the parable, we could add in the perspective that the absence of the stray harms the integrity of the flock. At COP26, voices were not only raised but also acknowledged concerning the responsibility of the rich global north nations who've thus far benefited financially from what both Catholic and Reformed churches identified as a fundamentally unjust global system. A responsibility there to pay out in recognition of loss and damage suffered by those on the front line of climate change, which is not without a cause. The Paris Agreement has an emphasis on averting, minimising loss and damage associated with climate change, including slow onset events. In other words, the lost sheep of cause and effect between pollution in one place and the suffering of people and planet elsewhere. This is being picked up and brought home, though whether to great rejoicing remains to be seen. The missing jigsaw pieces too of how what seemed merely beautiful is vital to the sustaining balance of creation. These are being put in place by science, back in the fold. Thus, developing countries have even greater justification in their call for compensation from developed countries.
The climate emergency is the result of an ethical, moral, and spiritual crisis manifested in a fixation on profit. The extractive and ultimately unsustainable systems of production and consumption by those complicit in this crisis continue to ignore increasing scientific and moral warnings. In this spirit, wealthier countries must lead in reducing their own emissions and in financing emission reductions of poorer nations. Industrialized countries must support the vulnerable countries. They must put into action a mechanism for loss and damage with additional funds. Love calls us to seek climate justice and restoration. It calls us to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, to protect them and their ancestral domains from predatory economic interests, and to learn from their ancient wisdom.
Because we share a planet, anything that's given is not wasted, it is to the benefit of all. In the closed system of Earth's climate, it really does do us good to do good to our neighbour. Remembering the reciprocal wording of things like the Ten Commandments, or even to our parents, that we may live long in the land the Lord is giving us. The figure of 100 billion was suggested, but certainly it has not yet found adequate backing, even from nations who've accepted and conceded the justice of the argument. That sounds a lot, but it is, for instance, far less than renewing UK's nuclear weapons. In the days of Boris Johnson, a figure of 11 billion from the UK was promised. I wonder if that will be honoured. Recent reports, though, suggest that these figures are a drop in the boiling acid ocean. What sort of shepherd could we find to pursue the wayward members of the global flock? Maybe that's where we need inspiration from the Old Testament passages to complement the lost sheep story. A lost sheep, by and large, hurts no one but themselves, but the waywardness of our economies, addicted to fossil fuels, as Admiral McGinn put it, causes wars and the displacement of people. And that's over and above the harm to those whose voices we, but not God, have disregarded. The earth, the heavens, the mountains, the hills, the land, all whom God grants a say in holding God's people to account. Even if only in this way, degrade the earth of a field, overfish an ocean, and you're not going to eat well. Our othering of fellow creatures and creation, holding them of no account, does serious harm to creation, including, of course, sooner or later, ourselves. But are we prepared to be sought out, brought back by a Christ who put so much effort into warnings we continue to ignore? Are we like the sheep, perhaps, humble enough to enjoy that liberation of being shown where we go wrong by the earth, our shepherd, to go ahead and make God's day? In a time of crisis, threat and emergency, we convince ourselves and others of the truth and urgency of action in all our activities, or everyone loses. Our aim is never to defeat opponents in debate, not to grind down those with whom we disagree, but to seek the way forward for the glory of God and the good of every creature. So don't stint on sustaining celebration. Don't stint on encouragement. Make sure the first small step is neither the last nor the greatest. Of the congregations who've taken the step of a bronze award, a fair few find themselves eager to look at the silver.
My congregations of Gartmore and Baclivey and West Stirlingshire have thoroughly enjoyed being involved in the Eco-Congregation programme over the last 2 or 3 years. From developing recycling models to ensuring that our energy is green, we have been involved in so many ways in the care of creation.
Let's go Eco, save the world!
So take your own needs for feeding seriously and forget that polite humility. You don't need to become sort of obnoxious green Bible basher to commend and aspire to a better, greener, happier life. So encouragement of yourself and others is a sacred duty, which is best pursued with sensitivity, with love and perseverance, and there may be rewards. So even at the risk of being thought as foolish as the unreasonably delighted shepherd, can churches bring that transforming power of love and forgiveness to every heated debate about policy, about planning, about net zero and the use of resources? Because if we do that, they'll know we are Christians by our love, won't they?